Trust is the rarest treasure in a world of crowns and daggers. These chilling words, written by a medieval chronicler, capture the bitter reality of life in the courts of Europe centuries ago. Behind the glittering tapestries and grand feasts lay a dangerous game, one where loyalty could vanish like smoke, and even the closest bonds could shatter in an instant. Betrayal wasn't just a plot twist in these halls of power. It was a force that toppled kings, erased bloodlines, and rewrote the maps of empires. Today, we're stepping into the shadows of history to uncover 29 of the most heartbreaking tales of deceit from medieval Europe, stories where love turned to poison, oaths dissolved into dust, and ambition left families broken. Picture this: a knight kneels before his king, swearing an oath of eternal fealty, only to raise his sword against that same sovereign months later. Or a queen whispering secrets to her closest confidante, unaware those words would seal her fate. What drove nobles, knights, and even parents and children to betray one another so ruthlessly? Was it greed, fear, or the unbearable weight of power itself? Each story we'll explore reveals a different facet of human nature, stripped bare by the high stakes of medieval politics. These aren't just dusty old accounts, they're pulse-pounding dramas of real people whose choices echo across history. Our journey begins with a royal family torn apart by the very thing that should have united them: ambition, a father's favoritism, a son's desperation, and a throne that became a battleground. But this is only the first thread in a tapestry of treachery that spans kingdoms and centuries. From poisoned goblets to forged letters, from whispered alliances to very public falls from grace, these tales will show you the medieval world as you've never seen it: raw, emotional, and unforgiving. So take a seat at the high table, but keep one hand on your dagger. In the courts of medieval Europe, trust was the first casualty, and no one, no matter how powerful, was truly safe. Isabella of France was called the she-wolf for a reason. Married to King Edward II of England at just 12 years old, she endured years of humiliation as her husband lavished favor on his controversial favorites, men like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, who wielded power like a weapon. But Isabella wasn't just a scorned queen, she was a strategist. By 1326, she'd had enough. With her husband's reign crumbling under mismanagement and resentment, she saw an opportunity. On a diplomatic trip to her native France, she met Roger Mortimer, a disgraced English noble with a grudge against Edward and a hunger for power. What began as a political alliance soon burned into something far more dangerous. Together, they raised an army and invaded England, promising reform. The people, weary of Edward's weak rule, rallied to her side. Edward never stood a chance. Abandoned by his own lords, he was captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III. But Isabella and Mortimer weren't content with just removing him from power. In a chilling act of cruelty, Edward was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, where whispers say his end came in the dead of night by a red-hot poker, a horror meant to leave no visible mark on the king's body. Whether the gruesome tale is true or not, one thing is certain: Isabella had betrayed not just her husband, but the very vows that bound her as queen. For 3 years, she and Mortimer ruled as de facto monarchs, until her own son, now grown, turned the tables. Mortimer was executed, and Isabella herself was confined to castle arrest for the rest of her days. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a seismic shift for England. The downfall of Edward II proved that no king, no matter how divinely appointed, was untouchable. It set a precedent that would haunt monarchs for centuries. If a ruler failed their people, even the crown could be torn away. But perhaps the most heartbreaking twist. Isabella's betrayal didn't bring her happiness. Power, it seemed, was a hollow prize, and she wasn't the only one who learned that lesson the hard way. In the next tale, we'll see how a trusted advisor's thirst for influence led to a king's ruin, and his own spectacular fall from grace. No one mastered the art of survival in Henry VIII's court quite like Thomas Cromwell until the day he didn't. A blacksmith's son who rose to become the king's right hand, Cromwell was the architect of England's break with Rome, the mastermind behind the dissolution of the monasteries, and the man who secured Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. For years, he seemed untouchable, navigating the lethal currents of Tudor politics with ruthless precision. But in the spring of 1540, the tides turned with terrifying speed. The man who had orchestrated the fall of so many, including Anne Boleyn, would soon learn how quickly favor could curdle into fatal suspicion. Cromwell's downfall began with a marriage gone wrong. Henry had hoped his union with Anne of Cleves would forge a crucial alliance with Protestant German states, but the moment he saw her, he recoiled. The king infamously called her the Flanders mare, and the marriage was dissolved within months. Cromwell, who had brokered the match, suddenly found himself blamed for the king's humiliation. But it wasn't just Henry's wounded pride that sealed his fate. The conservative faction at court, led by the Duke of Norfolk, had long resented Cromwell's influence and his Protestant reforms. They seized the moment, whispering to Henry that his minister was a traitor, a heretic secretly undermining the crown. The charges were absurd. Cromwell had devoted his life to strengthening Henry's power. Yet on June 10, 1540, he was arrested during a council meeting, dragged from the room as his enemies watched in silence. There was no trial, no chance to defend himself. The king's signature on the execution warrant was all it took. As Cromwell climbed the scaffold that July, he reportedly muttered, "I die in the Catholic faith, not doubting in any article of my faith." It was a final, desperate attempt to appease the king, but Henry's betrayal was absolute. What makes Cromwell's story so chilling isn't just the brutality of his fall, but how ordinary it had become. In Henry's England, loyalty meant nothing when politics shifted. The same king who had once called Cromwell the most faithful servant he ever had, now dismissed him as a traitorous villain. And Cromwell wasn't the only casualty of this ruthless world. His execution marked a turning point, a reminder that in the Tudor court, even the most skilled players could be sacrificed overnight. But why did betrayal so often revolve around religion? The answer lies in the seismic fractures of the Reformation. As Europe split between Catholic and Protestant, old alliances crumbled and new ones were forged in blood. To Henry, faith wasn't just a matter of conscience, it was a weapon, a bargaining chip, a test of loyalty. Cromwell had gambled on pushing England toward Protestantism, but when the king hesitated, that very ambition became a death sentence. In the next tale, we'll see how these same religious divides tore apart a royal family in Spain, where a queen's own daughter became her greatest enemy. Anne Boleyn's rise was as dazzling as her fall was brutal. The woman who had captivated Henry VIII, defied the Pope, and become Queen of England found herself trapped in the same web of intrigue she'd once mastered. By 1536, the king's passion had cooled, and whispers spread through the court like poison. Anne had failed to produce a male heir, only a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. Worse still, Henry's eye had already wandered to Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting whose quiet demeanor offered a stark contrast to Anne's fiery intelligence. But it wasn't just Henry's fickleness that doomed her. The very allies who had helped her topple Catherine of Aragon now saw Anne as a liability. Her uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, had once championed her cause. Yet when Henry's favor shifted, Norfolk didn't hesitate to abandon her. He wasn't alone. Thomas Cromwell, who had worked closely with Anne to advance Protestant reforms, now saw an opportunity to consolidate his own power by removing her. The charges were grotesque: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, a crime so unthinkable it shocked even jaded courtiers. The evidence was flimsy at best, cobbled together from coerced confessions and wild rumors. But in Henry's England, suspicion was enough. The trial was a spectacle of cruelty. Anne, once celebrated for her wit and charm, stood accused not just of treason but of witchcraft, her sharp tongue now twisted into proof of malice. Her brother George faced the same fate, their family's ambition unraveling into nightmare. On May 19, 1536, Anne mounted the scaffold, her voice steady as she praised the king one final time, a performance of loyalty to the very end. The French executioner's sword fell swiftly, a mercy Henry hadn't granted to all his victims. What makes Anne's betrayal so haunting isn't just its brutality, but its intimacy. The men who destroyed her weren't distant enemies. They were her kin, her allies, the architects of her rise. Norfolk's cold calculation, Cromwell's ruthless pragmatism, even Henry's wounded pride, all revealed a truth about power. In the Tudor court, loyalty lasted only as long as it was useful, and Anne's tragedy became a warning. No one, not even a queen, was safe when the winds changed. But betrayal wasn't always about kings and queens. Sometimes it cut closer to home, like the story of 2 brothers in Burgundy, where blood ties meant nothing against the lure of a crown. One would make a choice that would stain his name for centuries, proving that even family could fracture when power was at stake. Alfonso X of Castile was called the Wise for good reason, a scholar king who compiled legal codes, patronized astronomers, and dreamed of uniting Spain under his rule. But wisdom couldn't shield him from the treachery brewing in his own family. His son, Sancho, was everything Alfonso wasn't: brash, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. By 1282, Sancho's patience had worn thin. His father's failing health and unpopular taxes had weakened the crown, and Sancho saw his chance. What followed wasn't just a political coup, it was a slow, calculated unraveling of a father by his own blood. The betrayal began with whispers. Sancho courted disgruntled nobles, painting himself as the strong leader Castile needed. When Alfonso tried to disinherit him, Sancho didn't hesitate. He declared himself regent, rallying armies to his side while his father, now ill and isolated, could only watch as his kingdom splintered. The final blow came in 1284. Alfonso, broken and betrayed, died under mysterious circumstances. Some chroniclers hinted at poison, others at sheer heartbreak. Sancho wasted no time seizing the throne, rewriting history to justify his actions. The man who had once knelt before his father as a loyal prince now ruled as Sancho IV, his reign built on the ruins of filial duty. What makes this story so chilling isn't just the cold ambition, it's the intimacy of the betrayal. Sancho didn't just overthrow a king, he shattered the very bond that should have been unbreakable. In medieval Europe, family was supposed to be the bedrock of power. Yet here, a son turned his father's trust into a weapon. The lesson was clear: when a crown was at stake, even love could be sacrificed. But betrayal wasn't confined to palace walls. As the Crusades swept across Europe and the Holy Land, knights and kings carried their rivalries with them, sometimes with deadly consequences. In the next tale, we'll witness how a crusader's oath to God collided with his hunger for power, leaving a trail of broken alliances and a kingdom hanging in the balance. Conrad of Montferrat stood at the height of his power in the spring of 1192, a Crusader king ruling Jerusalem, a warrior who had defied Saladin himself, and a man who believed his alliances were unshakable. But in the shadowed corridors of the Holy Land, trust was a currency that vanished faster than desert mirages. On April 28th, as Conrad walked through the streets of Tyre, two men approached him with folded hands, as if in supplication. In a flash, daggers struck. The assassins, members of the feared Hashishin order, left him bleeding on the cobblestones, a king cut down not in battle, but by treachery. The question that haunted history wasn't just who wielded the blades, but who had pointed them. Rumors swirled that Richard the Lionheart, England's crusading monarch, had secretly sanctioned the murder. The two men had been allies but also rivals. Richard supported Conrad's rival, Guy of Lusignan, for the throne of Jerusalem. When Conrad's political maneuvering threatened to fracture the Crusader ranks, some whispered that Richard saw removal as the only solution. The Lionheart denied it vehemently, even executing one of the assassins in a public display of outrage. Yet doubt lingered like smoke after a siege. Had Richard's ambition or impatience crossed into betrayal? The truth may never be known, but Conrad's death exposed the brutal calculus of Crusader politics. In the Holy Land, alliances shifted like sand. Yesterday's brother-in-arms could become tomorrow's obstacle, and faith mattered less than power. Even the assassins, often portrayed as fanatics, were pragmatists, their daggers for hire to the highest bidder. Conrad learned too late that in this world, crowns made targets of the men who wore them. Yet not all betrayals were forged in war councils or whispered in palace corridors. Some began with a kiss, like the scandal that shattered the court of Navarre, where a queen's passion collided with her duty, and love became the deadliest weapon of all. Love stories rarely end well in the halls of power, but few are as haunting as the tale of Inês de Castro and Prince Pedro of Portugal. Their romance began innocently enough. Inês, a Galician noblewoman, arrived at the Portuguese court as a lady-in-waiting to Pedro's young bride. But when that marriage ended in tragedy, Pedro's grief turned to passion, and Inês became the love of his life. They built a world of their own, away from Lisbon's scheming court, raising 4 children in the quiet hills of Coimbra. To Pedro, she was more than a mistress, she was his heart's compass, but to King Afonso IV, she was a threat that could not be ignored. The king's fears weren't just about scandal. Inês' family, the Castros, were powerful rivals, enemies of Portugal in the bitter conflicts between Iberian kingdoms. Afonso saw danger in every whisper between Pedro and Inês, convinced their love would drag Portugal into war. Worse still, rumors swirled that Pedro might legitimize their children, placing them in line for the throne. The nobility, already uneasy, pressed Afonso to act. In 1355, while Pedro was away hunting, the king made his move. 3 of his knights cornered Inês in the gardens of the Santa Clara monastery. She pleaded for her life, clutching their knees as her children wept nearby. The chronicles say even her executioners hesitated, but duty prevailed. With a single stroke of a sword, Portugal's most famous love story became its most infamous betrayal. Pedro's revenge was as brutal as it was legendary. When he became king 2 years later, he hunted down Inês' killers, tearing out their hearts with his own hands, or so the stories claim. He exhumed her body, crowned her posthumously as queen, and forced the court to kneel before her decaying corpse, kissing her skeletal hand in homage. It was a grotesque theater of grief, a king's defiance of the very father who had tried to protect his throne. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just the violence, it's how ordinary it seemed at the time. Afonso wasn't a monster, he was a king doing what kings did, sacrificing one life to safeguard thousands. Yet his calculation failed spectacularly. Instead of uniting Portugal, the murder fractured the royal family and pushed Pedro into the arms of Castile, the very enemy Afonso had feared. The tragedy exposed a painful truth. In medieval courts, love was often the most dangerous rebellion of all. But betrayal wasn't always a blade in the shadows. Sometimes it unfolded on the battlefield, where a single act of treachery could tip the scales of war, like the fateful choice of a French knight that would hand England its most shocking victory. George of Podbrady should have been untouchable, a warrior king who united Bohemia, fended off foreign invaders, and earned the loyalty of his people. But in 15th century Europe, faith divided even the strongest rulers from their subjects. A Hussite king ruling a land torn between Catholicism and Reform, George walked a razor's edge. His nobles, many of them Catholic traditionalists, bristled at his tolerance for Protestant reforms. They whispered that his dream of a united Christian Europe was heresy disguised as diplomacy. And when Pope Pius II excommunicated him in 1466, those whispers became a roar. The betrayal came not from foreign enemies, but from the men who had sworn oaths at his coronation. Led by the powerful Rosenberg family, a faction of nobles secretly reached out to Hungary's King Matthias Corvinus, offering him the Bohemian crown in exchange for dismantling George's reforms. The irony was brutal. George had once mentored Matthias, treating him like a son. Now, the young king turned that trust into a weapon, invading Bohemia under the banner of defending the true faith. Even George's own brother-in-law, the Duke of Saxony, joined the conspiracy, proving that blood meant nothing when religion and power collided. What makes this betrayal so devastating is how calculated it was. The nobles didn't just abandon George, they weaponized his greatest strengths against him. His reputation as a peacemaker, they painted it as weakness. His efforts to balance Catholic and Hussite interests, they called it hypocrisy. By the time Matthias's armies crossed the border, George found himself isolated, branded a heretic by the church and a tyrant by his own lords. He fought back with the same pragmatism that had built his kingdom, even striking a temporary truce with Matthias by naming him his heir, a move that shocked his supporters. But the damage was done. When George died in 1471, his legacy fractured like the kingdom he'd tried to unite. This wasn't just a political downfall, it was a warning. In an age where faith dictated loyalty, even the most skilled rulers could be undone by those closest to them. And if nobles could betray their king, what stopped children from turning against their parents? The next tale answers that question with a story so shocking it redefined treachery, a daughter's betrayal that would leave a queen imprisoned by her own blood. Henry II of England was a ruler who seemed to have it all, an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, a brilliant legal mind, and a queen as formidable as she was famous. Helena of Aquitaine had once been the wife of a French king before marrying Henry, bringing her vast lands and sharp political instincts to their union. Together, they should have been unstoppable, but their greatest weakness lay not in their enemies, it slept under their own roof. Their eldest son, Henry the young king, was crowned as his father's heir at just 15, a gesture meant to secure the succession. Instead, it lit the fuse of a rebellion that would tear the family apart. The young king wasn't just ambitious, he was impatient. Though he wore a crown, he wielded no real power. His father kept him on a tight leash, refusing to grant him lands or autonomy. To a prince raised on tales of chivalry and glory, this was unbearable. And he wasn't alone in his resentment. Helena, once Henry II's closest ally, had grown disillusioned with her husband's infidelities and his heavy-handed rule. When their son whispered of rebellion, she didn't hesitate. In 1173, the unthinkable happened. The young king fled to the French court, where his mother's former husband, King Louis VII, eagerly welcomed him. Together, they rallied disgruntled nobles, including Henry's own younger brothers, Richard and Geoffrey. The family that had built an empire now turned their swords against one another. The war that followed was as brutal as it was personal. Castles burned, towns were sacked, and mercenaries roamed the countryside. At one point, the young king even hired a band of ruthless Brabanton soldiers, unleashing them on his father's land. Henry II, a master tactician, fought back with cold precision, but the betrayal cut deeper than any battlefield loss. This wasn't just a revolt, it was a rejection of everything he'd built. The conflict dragged on for years, ending only when the young king, abandoned by many of his allies, fell ill with dysentery and died at 28. His last act, begging his father's forgiveness, a plea that came too late to heal the wounds he'd inflicted. The tragedy of Henry the young king isn't just a story of a son's rebellion, it's a warning about the poison of dynastic politics. When power is tied to blood, even love can curdle into rivalry. And if kings couldn't trust their own families, who could they trust? The answer, as we'll see next, was often no one, not even the men of God. Because in the shadows of medieval Europe's grand cathedrals, betrayal wore a different mask: the robes of a cardinal, the smile of a trusted advisor, and the whispered lies that could bring down an empire. Thomas Beckett and Henry II were once so close, contemporaries joked they shared one mind. Beckett, the king's charming and clever chancellor, had been Henry's drinking companion, his confidant, even the tutor to his heir. So when Henry engineered Beckett's appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, it seemed like the perfect scheme, a trusted friend who would keep the church in line with royal authority. But Henry had gravely miscalculated. The moment Beckett donned the archbishop's robes, something inside him shifted. The lavish courtier who had once hunted with the king now wore a hair shirt beneath his vestments, fasting and praying like a monk. Worse still, he began fiercely defending the church's independence, blocking Henry's efforts to try clergy in royal courts. The king's puppet had cut his own strings. Henry's rage simmered for years, but it boiled over in 1170. When Beckett excommunicated bishops who sided with the crown, the king reportedly shouted words that would echo through history: "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" It wasn't an official order, just the outburst of a frustrated ruler, but 4 knights took it as a royal command. On December 29th, they stormed Canterbury Cathedral as Beckett knelt at Vespers. Witnesses later described how the archbishop forbade his monks from barring the doors, saying, "The church must not become a fortress." The knights demanded he submit to the king's will. When Beckett refused, their swords fell, splitting his skull so deeply one blade shattered on the stone floor. The aftermath was as shocking as the crime itself. Beckett's blood-stained vestments became sacred relics overnight. Miracles were reported at his tomb, and within 2 years, the Pope declared him a saint. Henry, horrified by the backlash, walked barefoot through Canterbury in penance, allowing monks to scourge his back with rods, but the damage was done. Beckett's martyrdom became a rallying cry for church autonomy, proving that even kings couldn't control faith. Their friendship had died long before the sword struck, not just from political disagreement, but from the bitterest betrayal of all. 2 men who truly understood each other, yet chose power over reconciliation. While England reeled from this sacrilege, another empire faced treachery of its own, one where betrayal didn't just topple friendships, but blinded an emperor. In the glittering courts of Byzantium, a general's ambition would prove that no throne, no matter how ancient, was safe from a knife in the dark. Constantinople in the 12th century was a city of golden domes and whispered plots, where the throne of the Byzantine Empire gleamed like a prize too tempting to resist. Andronikos Komnenos understood this better than anyone. A charismatic general with a taste for danger, he'd spent years exiled from court, plotting his return while the empire crumbled under weak rulers. His chance came in 1182 when his cousin, Emperor Alexios II, was just a boy, a puppet in the hands of corrupt advisors. Andronikos arrived like a savior, swearing to protect the young emperor from those who would exploit him. The nobles cheered, the people sighed with relief. No one yet saw the serpent in their midst. What followed was betrayal so cold it stunned even jaded Byzantines. First, Andronikos isolated Alexios, poisoning his mind against his own mother, Empress Maria. Then, with the court divided, he struck. Maria was arrested on trumped-up charges of treason, strangled in her cell. The 12-year-old Alexios, forced to sign his mother's death warrant, became a hollow figurehead. Andronikos, now the power behind the throne, didn't stop there. He married Alexios's young widow, further cementing his claim. But legitimacy wasn't enough, not for a man who craved absolute control. Months later, Alexios was found dead, his body bearing marks of strangulation. The boy who had trusted Andronikos as a protector was discarded like yesterday's news. Yet power seized through blood rarely brings peace. Andronikos's reign became a masterclass in paranoia. Convinced every shadow hid a conspirator, he unleashed a reign of terror, executing nobles by the dozens. Some were blinded, the traditional Byzantine punishment for treason. Others met messier fates, flayed alive, burned at the stake, or hurled from the city's towering walls. The streets of Constantinople ran red, and with each execution, Andronikos's grip on the empire weakened. The very cruelty that had won him the throne now turned his subjects against him. His downfall came as swiftly as his rise. When the Normans invaded Byzantium in 1185, Andronikos's armies, demoralized by his tyranny, crumbled. The people of Constantinople, weary of his butchery, rose in revolt. Abandoned by all, the emperor fled in disguise, but there was no escape. Captured by an angry mob, he was dragged through the streets for days, beaten, mutilated, and finally torn apart. His severed head was tossed into the sewers, a fitting end for a man who had clawed his way to power over the bodies of his kin. Andronikos's story exposes the fatal flaw of Byzantine politics. Betrayal might win a throne, but it could never hold one. Yet treachery wasn't confined to palaces. Even among knights sworn to codes of honor, loyalty could shatter when ambition whispered. Across the sea in the Crusader states, one man's deception would prove that no oath was sacred when a crown hung in the balance. The Knights Templar were more than just warriors, they were bankers, diplomats, and one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. By the early 14th century, their network stretched from Jerusalem to London, their vaults overflowing with gold from kings and pilgrims alike. But that very wealth would become their undoing. King Philip IV of France, nicknamed the Fair for his golden looks but not his morals, owed the Templars a staggering fortune. His wars with England and Flanders had drained his coffers, and his attempts to tax the clergy had backfired spectacularly. Desperate and cornered, Philip saw an opportunity. If the Templars ceased to exist, so would his debts. The betrayal began with whispers. Philip's spies spread rumors that the Templars practiced dark rituals, kissing the devil, spitting on the cross, and engaging in unspeakable acts during secret initiation rites. Whether he believed these lies or simply found them useful hardly mattered. On Friday, October 13, 1307, a date that would forever stain the calendar with superstition, Philip struck. In a meticulously coordinated dawn raid, every Templar in France was arrested simultaneously: Grand Masters, knights, even elderly servants. the charges. Heresy, blasphemy, and sodomy. Under torture, confessions flowed like wine. Jacques de Molay, the order's Grand Master, endured years of brutal interrogation before finally breaking. His forced admission sealed the fate of thousands. Philip didn't stop there. He pressured Pope Clement V, a weak pontiff installed with French backing, to dissolve the entire order. The papal bull Vox in Excelso in 1312 officially disbanded the Templars, their lands confiscated, their legacy tarnished, but the true horror came at the stake. On March 18, 1314, de Molay and his closest allies were burned alive on an island in the Seine. As flames licked his body, the Grand Master reportedly cursed both Philip and Clement, summoning them to God's judgment within a year. Whether by coincidence or divine wrath, both men were dead within months. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just its scale, it's the hypocrisy. Philip had once knelt before these same knights, borrowing their gold to fund his wars. The Templars had safeguarded Crusader treasures, built Europe's first true banking system, and answered only to the Pope. Yet none of that mattered when a king's greed outweighed honor. Their destruction sent a clear message. No institution, no matter how sacred, was safe from royal ambition. But treachery wasn't confined to sunlit French courts. Far to the north, in the frostbitten halls of Scandinavia, another king would learn that betrayal could come from the unlikeliest place, his own bedchamber. Where gold failed to break the Templars, love would shatter a crown. King Eric V of Denmark never saw the knives coming. On a cold November night in 1286, the 37-year-old monarch retired to his barn in Finderup after a long day of hunting, expecting nothing more sinister than a night's rest. But as he slept, a group of masked men slipped past his guards, their identities hidden beneath cloaks and darkness. What happened next was swift and brutal. The king was stabbed over 50 times, his body left in a grotesque tableau of violence. The murder wasn't just a crime, it was a political earthquake because the killers weren't foreign assassins or rogue mercenaries. They were his own nobles, men who had knelt before him in fealty, only to repay his trust with cold steel. Denmark in the 13th century was a kingdom perpetually on the brink. The monarchy, still finding its footing after centuries of Viking rule, relied heavily on the support of powerful noble families. But Eric had made enemies. His father, Christopher I, had clashed with the church and aristocracy, leaving a legacy of resentment. Eric inherited those tensions, compounded by his own heavy-handed policies. When he imposed new taxes and challenged noble privileges, the whispers of rebellion grew louder. The final straw, rumor claimed he'd dishonored the wife of a prominent lord, a stain on honor that demanded blood. The investigation that followed was a farce. Though the names of the conspirators were an open secret, mask Stig Andersen, Jacob Nielsen, and others, no one was ever formally punished. The killers fled to fortified castles beyond the reach of royal justice. Eric's young son, Eric VI, was left to rule a fractured kingdom, his father's murder a grim lesson in the fragility of power. For decades afterward, the crime haunted Denmark. Ballads and chronicles painted Eric as a martyr, his death a warning to kings who forgot that even a crown couldn't shield them from the wrath of those they ruled. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just its brutality, but its mundanity. In medieval Denmark, regicide wasn't some unthinkable taboo, it was a political tool. The nobles didn't see themselves as villains, they were correcting a king who'd overstepped, and Eric's fate proved that in a world where power was negotiated daily, loyalty was as thin as the parchment oaths were written on. But if Denmark's nobles showed how quickly loyalty could fracture, the 100 Years' War would reveal an even darker truth. sometimes betrayal wasn't just personal, it was profitable. Across the English Channel, a French knight's greed would hand England one of its most shocking victories, proving that in war, gold could buy more than armies. It could turn brother against brother. Charles the Bad of Navarre earned his name not through incompetence, but through a lifetime of cunning betrayals that finally caught up with him in the most horrific way imaginable. This 14th century ruler played England and France against each other like pieces on a chessboard, switching allegiances whenever it suited his ambitions. Born into a tangled web of royal claims descended from French kings through his mother, yet ruling the Pyrenean kingdom of Navarre, Charles saw every crisis as an opportunity. When the 100 Years' War erupted, he didn't pick a side. He played both, promising military support to England's Edward III while secretly negotiating with France's John II. His first great betrayal came in 1356. After John II arrested him for conspiring with the English, Charles swore oaths of loyalty to secure his release, only to immediately join forces with Edward's son, the Black Prince, in ravaging French lands. The pattern repeated for decades: pledges of friendship followed by secret plots, marriages arranged for alliances then abandoned, even rumors he poisoned his own brother-in-law to claim lands. By 1378, his reputation was so toxic that chroniclers wrote of him as a man whose word was as fleeting as winter sunlight. The final reckoning came not on the battlefield, but in a sick. After years of political isolation, the 54-year-old Charles fell gravely ill. His physicians prescribed a radical treatment, wrapping his emaciated body in linen soaked in brandy to soothe his pain. What happened next reads like divine retribution. A servant, perhaps careless or possibly vengeful, brought a candle too close to the alcohol-drenched bandages. Flames engulfed the king instantly. Trapped in his metal-reinforced bed, Charles burned alive in agonizing slow motion, his screams echoing through the palace at Pamplona. Even his enemies shuddered at the news, not just at the horror of his death, but at its symbolism. The man who'd spent a lifetime playing with fire had finally been consumed by it. Charles's story exposes the fatal flaw of political opportunism. In an era where oaths bound society together, his constant betrayals left him without allies when he needed them most. The kings he'd manipulated, the nobles he'd double-crossed, none lifted a finger to save him. His gruesome end became a cautionary tale whispered in courts across Europe. Treachery might win battles, but it builds no lasting legacy. Yet betrayal wasn't always about kings and crowns. Sometimes the most shocking acts of disloyalty unfolded in places where power was still being forged, like the wild, war-torn court of medieval Scotland, where a guardian's greed would fracture a nation already bleeding from English invasions. Here in the misty Highlands, a man named William Wallace had become a legend for resisting foreign rule. But his greatest enemy wouldn't be the English army, it would be a fellow Scot he'd once called brother. William Douglas was the most powerful man in Scotland until the moment he wasn't. As the Black Douglas, head of a dynasty that had fought alongside Robert the Bruce, his family's name alone struck fear into enemies and kings alike. But young James II, barely 18 years old, had grown tired of nobles who acted like rulers themselves. In 1452, the king invited Douglas to Stirling Castle under the guise of peaceful talks, even offering him safe conduct. It was a trap. As they dined in the castle's great hall, James's face darkened with accusations Douglas had conspired with rebels, ignored royal commands, and grown too bold. When Douglas refused to abandon his alliances, the king drew a dagger. His attendants followed suit, surrounding the earl like wolves. The chronicles say Douglas pleaded for his life, reminding James of the safe passage promised. The king's reply was chilling. A king's word binds except when treason stains it. With that, the young monarch plunged his blade into Douglas's chest, then ordered his body hurled from the castle window into the ravine below. This wasn't just murder, it was a message. James left the corpse unburied for days, a grotesque spectacle for all who doubted royal power. The Black Douglas's lands were seized, his family scattered. Yet the brutality backfired. Instead of cowing Scotland's nobles, it ignited a civil war that raged for years, proving that even kings couldn't escape the consequences of betrayal. James had wanted to emulate the ruthless efficiency of England's Plantagenets, but he learned too late that Scotland's fractious clans would never bow quietly. Far from the misty highlands, another kind of betrayal was unfolding, one where daggers struck in candlelit palazzos rather than castle halls. In Renaissance Italy, power wasn't just about bloodlines, it was an art form polished by bankers and condottieri who played chess with cities as their board. And no family mastered the game or suffered its cruelties like the Sforzas of Milan. When Galazzo Maria Sforza inherited the dukedom in 1466, he brought a reign of terror masked in silk. His vices were legendary. He stalked the streets at night, forcing noblewomen into his bedchamber, while his tax collectors bled the people dry. Even his own brothers plotted against him, but the fatal blow came from an unexpected quarter: 3 young idealists who saw murder as a divine duty. On December 26, 1476, as Galazzo knelt in Milan's St. Stephen's Church, they struck like avenging angels, their blades piercing his throat, chest, and back. The assassins weren't mercenaries or rivals, but men who believed they were saving Milan from tyranny. The aftermath revealed Italy's darkest truth. Though the killers were swiftly executed, their martyrdom inspired others. The Sforzas clung to power, but the illusion of stability had shattered. In a land where republics and duchies rose and fell like theater sets, betrayal wasn't just personal, it was the price of ambition. And as the Renaissance dawned, one family in Florence would learn this lesson in blood, proving that even patrons of art and learning weren't safe from the knives of those they trusted most. Galazzo Maria Sforza ruled Milan with a velvet glove lined with iron. The Duke was a paradox, a patron of arts and music who commissioned some of the Renaissance's most breathtaking works, yet a tyrant whose cruelty became the stuff of nightmares. His court glittered with poets and scholars, but the streets whispered of his darker obsessions: a habit of abducting noblewomen, a network of spies that turned friends into informants, and a temper so vicious even his closest advisors flinched. By 1476, the whispers had grown into roars. The man who'd once been celebrated as a golden prince had become a monster in brocade. The conspiracy against him wasn't the work of foreign enemies or rival dynasties. It bloomed in his own inner circle. 3 young courtiers, each with their own bitter grievances, found common cause in their hatred for the Duke. Giovanni Andrea Lampugnoni, a nobleman whose family lands had been seized by Galazzo, nursed a private fury. Carlo Visconti, whose sister had been one of the Duke's unwilling conquests, carried the weight of a brother's shame. And Girolamo Olgiotti, barely 20 years old, saw himself as an avenger, a Brutus for a new age, convinced that killing a tyrant was a divine mandate. Together, they planned their strike with chilling precision, choosing the feast of St. Stephen when Galazzo would kneel unguarded in prayer. The moment played out like a scene from a tragic play. As the Duke entered Milan's Santo Stefano church, the conspirators moved like shadows. Lampugnoni approached first, dropping to his knees as if to beg a favor, then drove his dagger into Galazzo's groin. Visconti and Olgiotti struck next, their blades finding his back and throat. The Duke collapsed, bleeding onto the marble floor as screams echoed through the nave. His last words, according to one chronicler, were a stunned, "What is this?" A fitting epitaph for a man who never imagined his own court could turn against him. The aftermath exposed the fragility of Renaissance power. Lampugnani was killed by the Duke's guards moments later, his body torn apart by the mob. Visconti and Olgiotti were captured, tortured, and executed, their limbs displayed on the city gates as a warning. Yet their deaths couldn't undo the lesson they'd etched in blood. No ruler, no matter how feared, was safe from the rage of those he oppressed. Galazzo's widow, Bona of Savoy, scrambled to secure power for their young son, but Milan never fully recovered its stability. The assassination became a blueprint for future plots, proving that in the cutthroat world of Italian city-states, even the grandest duke was just one betrayal away from a dagger in the dark. But if Renaissance Italy taught the dangers of unchecked tyranny, the Holy Roman Empire offered a different lesson, one where betrayal wasn't born of revenge, but of cold political calculus. Far to the north, an emperor's trusted advisor would make a choice that fractured an empire, proving that in the Game of Thrones, loyalty was always the first sacrifice. Conradin was just 16 years old when he rode into Italy, golden-haired and brimming with the confidence of his bloodline. The last direct heir of the mighty Hohenstaufen dynasty, he carried the weight of emperors on his slender shoulders. Frederick II, his grandfather, had once ruled from Germany to Sicily, a scholar king who dazzled and terrified Christendom in equal measure. But empires crumble, and by 1268, Conradin's inheritance had been reduced to a single, desperate gamble. His rival, Charles of Anjou, brother to the French king, had seized Sicily with papal blessing, carving up Hohenstaufen lands with the relish of a butcher. To Conradin, reclaiming his birthright wasn't just ambition, it was destiny. The betrayal came not on the battlefield, but after it. At Tagliacozzo, Conradin's youthful bravado met Charles's seasoned ruthlessness. The young prince fought valiantly, but his forces were outmaneuvered. When the tide turned, he fled first to Rome, then toward the coast, hoping to escape by sea. But the Italian nobles who'd pledged him loyalty vanished like mist. One by one, his allies closed their gates. Even his closest companion, Frederick of Baden, couldn't shield him from the inevitable. Captured near Estura by Giovanni Frangipani, a man who'd once bowed to Hohenstaufen rule, Conradin was handed to Charles like a trussed-up stag. What followed was no ordinary execution. Charles, a man who understood the power of spectacle, staged Conradin's death as a warning to all who might challenge Angevin rule. In the marketplace of Naples, before a crowd of stunned onlookers, the teenage prince and Frederick were led to the scaffold. Conradin, ever the Hohenstaufen, flung his glove into the crowd, begging someone to carry his memory forward. Then the axe fell, not once but twice. The last male heir of Europe's most illustrious dynasty died without a whimper, his head displayed alongside his friends like common criminals. Charles thought he'd extinguished a threat. Instead, he created a martyr. Conradin's death became a rallying cry for generations of anti-Angevin rebels, proof that power seized through treachery could never truly settle on a king's brow. But if Italy's wars were brutal, they were nothing compared to the betrayals festering in the Crusader East, where a kingdom's survival often hinged on the loyalty of mercenaries, and even holy vows could bend under the weight of gold. Guy of Lusignan had the crown of Jerusalem, but never the loyalty it demanded. When he ascended the throne in 1186 through his marriage to Queen Sibylla, the kingdom was already crumbling, besieged by Saladin's armies and fractured by nobles who saw the new king as an upstart, a French knight with more ambition than sense. His fatal mistake wasn't weakness but misplaced trust. The very men who should have defended Christendom's holiest city were already plotting behind his back. Raymond of Tripoli, the seasoned statesman who'd once ruled as regent, despised Guy from the start. He saw the king's recklessness as a death sentence for Jerusalem. When Saladin's forces massed at the gates, Raymond refused to commit his troops, secretly negotiating a truce with the Sultan instead. Another powerful lord, Raynald of Chatillon, provoked Saladin deliberately, breaking treaties and attacking caravans knowing full well Guy would bear the consequences. Even Gerard de Riedfort, Grand Master of the Templars, pushed Guy toward disaster, urging him to march into the desert without adequate water or supplies. The result, the catastrophe at Hattin in 1187, where Crusader forces were annihilated under the scorching sun. Saladin's troops surrounded them, capturing Guy and executing Raynald with his own sword. Jerusalem fell within months, its sacred relics paraded through Damascus as trophies. The bitter irony, Guy survived. Released by Saladin 2 years later, he washed up on the shores of Cyprus, where he somehow convinced Richard the Lionheart to make him king of a new realm. But the stain of betrayal never faded. His own allies had sacrificed Jerusalem to prove a point, that a crown granted by marriage meant nothing without the respect of those who fought beneath its banner. While Guy licked his wounds in Cyprus, another court simmered with treachery, this time in the heart of France. Here, a queen's whispered secrets would ignite a scandal so explosive, it nearly toppled the Capetian dynasty itself. The players, a king too pious to notice his wife's despair, a knight too handsome for his own good, and a necklace that became the noose around their necks. Charles de Bourbon was the most powerful noble in France until he wasn't. As constable of the kingdom and cousin to King Francis I, he commanded armies, governed vast lands, and stood second only to the crown itself. But in the cutthroat world of Renaissance politics, even the mightiest could fall overnight. By 1523, Bourbon's relationship with Francis had soured into something poisonous. The king, wary of his cousin's influence, had begun stripping away his titles and lands, even blocking his marriage to a wealthy heiress. To a man of Bourbon's pride, this wasn't just humiliation, it was a declaration of war. His revenge would shake Europe to its core. Secretly, Bourbon reached out to France's greatest enemy, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The offer he made was staggering. In exchange for imperial support, he promised to turn his armies against Francis, carving open France from within. The emperor, locked in a bitter rivalry with the French king, didn't hesitate. Money, mercenaries, and promises flowed into Bourbon's hands. When the betrayal was revealed, the shockwaves rippled through every court on the continent. This wasn't just a noble switching sides, it was the unthinkable spectacle of France's military mastermind leading foreign troops against his own homeland. The campaign that followed was as brutal as it was audacious. Bourbon's forces stormed through Provence, laying siege to Marseille in 1524. Had the city fallen, the path to Paris would have been wide open. But the defenders held, and Bourbon's gamble began to unravel. Without a quick victory, his mercenaries grew restless, his funds dwindled, and the emperor's support wavered. Desperate, he turned south, joining imperial forces in Italy. It was there, outside the walls of Rome in 1527, that his story reached its bloody climax. Leading the assault on the Eternal City, Bourbon was struck by a sniper's bullet, some say fired by the artist Benvenuto Cellini himself. The man who had betrayed a kingdom died in the mud, his body looted by his own soldiers. Rome was sacked in horrors that stunned Christendom, but Bourbon never lived to see it. His legacy became a cautionary tale of Renaissance realpolitik. In an age where loyalty was negotiable, even the highest-born could become fugitives. Yet for all his ambition, Bourbon's betrayal brought him no glory, only infamy and an unmarked grave. But if France's courtiers learned the cost of treachery, another kingdom was about to face a betrayal far closer to home. Across the frozen plains of Eastern Europe, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth stood as a beacon of noble liberty, until one man's ambition exposed the fragility of their golden freedom. Ladislaw III of Poland rode toward Varna in 1444 with the weight of Christendom on his shoulders. Just 20 years old, he'd already earned the name Varna for his earlier victories against the Ottomans, and now he led a crusade to halt Sultan Murad II's march into Europe. The Hungarian and Polish knights at his back believed in him, but his own advisors carried whispers in their hearts. Cardinal Julian Cesarini, the papal legate, had assured Ladislaw that victory was divinely ordained. John Hunyadi, the battle-hardened Hungarian general, urged caution, yet his warnings were drowned out by the cardinal's fervor. The king, young and devout, trusted the wrong voices. The battle unfolded like a nightmare. Though outnumbered, the Christian forces initially held their ground until a fatal misstep. Cesarini convinced Ladislaw to abandon Hunyadi's defensive strategy and charge directly at the Ottoman camp, promising the Sultan's forces would crumble. But it was a trap. The Ottoman cavalry feigned retreat, luring the king's wing into a killing zone. As Ladislaw's horse stumbled in the mud, János Hunyadi's reinforcements were inexplicably delayed. Some chroniclers later claimed certain nobles held back their troops deliberately, resentful of the Polish king's authority over Hungarian forces. Whether by malice or miscalculation, the result was the same. Ladislaw was surrounded, his golden crown glinting as Ottoman janissaries pulled him from his saddle. His severed head, mounted on a pike, became the Sultan's grisly trophy, a warning to all who dared challenge Ottoman might. The tragedy at Varna wasn't just a military defeat, it was a masterclass in the treachery of counsel. Cesarini, who'd pushed for the fatal charge, vanished in the chaos. Some said he drowned fleeing across the Danube, weighed down by guilt. The nobles who hesitated to aid their king, they returned home unscathed, their lands untouched. Ladislaw's trust had been his undoing, proving that in medieval warfare, the greatest dangers often wore friendly faces. But misplaced loyalty wasn't unique to the battlefields of Eastern Europe. Far to the west, in the sun-baked courts of Castile, another ruler would learn that betrayal could wear a far sweeter mask. The smile of a wife who'd grown tired of playing second fiddle to power. Pedro of Castile earned his grim nickname long before the dagger struck. By 1369, his reign had become a tapestry of violence, rivals executed, nobles tortured, even his own wife rumored to have been poisoned to make way for his mistress. But in medieval Spain, cruelty was a double-edged sword. The very brutality that kept Pedro on the throne also forged his downfall, as his half-brother Henry of Trastámara watched and waited. Born to King Alfonso XI and his longtime mistress, Henry had spent years simmering in the shadows, biding his time while Pedro alienated one ally after another. The breaking point came when Pedro murdered yet another noble, this time Henry's close friend. That blood-stained moment transformed resentment into rebellion. Henry's betrayal wasn't some hasty coup, it was a masterclass in patience. First, he fled to France, securing support from King Charles V. Then, with French gold and mercenaries, he launched a campaign that split Castile in two. Towns that had suffered under Pedro's rule flocked to Henry's banner, while the king's remaining supporters found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. The final confrontation came at Montiel in 1369, where Pedro, desperate and cornered, sought refuge in a castle. What happened next was less a battle than a carefully staged assassination. Henry's ally, the French knight Bertrand du Guesclin, lured Pedro into a tent under pretense of negotiation. The moment the king stepped inside, Henry's men seized him. The chronicles describe a frantic struggle, Pedro biting Henry's hand as his half-brother's dagger found his throat. The aftermath revealed the cold calculus of medieval power. Henry didn't just kill Pedro, he erased him. The body was displayed for days, stripped of royal insignia, while chroniclers loyal to the new regime painted Pedro as a monster. Yet history's irony is bitter. Henry's triumph birthed the Trastámara dynasty, but its legacy was built on the same violence he'd condemned. Within generations, his descendants would face their own betrayals, proving that in Spain's bloody courts, no throne was ever truly secure. Far from the sun-baked plains of Castile, another empire was unraveling from within. The Byzantine civil wars of the 14th century turned brother against brother in a struggle where betrayal wasn't just personal, it was existential. As rival emperors vied for control of Constantinople's crumbling walls, a once glorious empire became a chessboard for mercenaries and schemers, and at the heart of it all stood John VI Cantacuzeninos, a man who would learn that in Byzantium, even a crown couldn't shield you from the knives of those you called family. John VI Cantacuzeninos began his career as the most trusted advisor in Byzantium, a general so loyal to Emperor Andronikos III that historians called him the empire's second soul. But in the crumbling world of 14th century Constantinople, loyalty was a currency that lost value by the hour. When Andronikos died suddenly in 1341, leaving his 9-year-old son John V as heir, Cantacuzeninos faced a choice: serve the child emperor faithfully or seize power for himself. The empire, already fractured by civil wars and Ottoman invasions, needed a steady hand. What it got was a masterclass in political betrayal. At first, Cantacuzeninos played the role of devoted regent, swearing oaths to protect young John V. But within months, he crowned himself co-emperor in a midnight ceremony, claiming the throne was his by right of experience. The nobility split like cracked marble. Some backed the child, others the general. What followed wasn't just a civil war, but a series of betrayals so convoluted they read like a tragic play. Cantacuzeninos, desperate for allies, invited the Ottoman Sultan Orhan to send troops, marrying his own daughter to a Muslim ruler in exchange for soldiers. The same man who'd once defended Christendom now armed its greatest enemies against his own people. The irony: his reign collapsed under the weight of its own deceit. After 6 years of war, Cantacuzeninos finally deposed John V, only to face rebellion from every corner. His Ottoman allies demanded more land than he could give. The clergy denounced him as a heretic for his dealings with Muslims. Even his own son-in-law, John V, whom he'd imprisoned and then released out of guilt, returned with an army. In 1354, the man who'd clawed his way to power was forced to abdicate, retiring to a monastery where he spent his final years writing memoirs that painted himself as Byzantium's savior. History remembered him differently, as proof that treachery, once unleashed, becomes a tide no ruler can control. Yet if Cantacuzeninos' story shows how betrayal corrodes empires, the Wars of the Roses would reveal its power to reshape kingdoms. Across the sea in England, a royal family was about to tear itself apart, not with whispered conspiracies, but on the battlefield where the stakes were even higher. Because in this war, betrayal wouldn't just cost a crown, it would rewrite the future of a nation. George, Duke of Clarence, had everything a medieval prince could want: wealth, royal blood, and the ear of his brother, King Edward IV of England. Yet in the treacherous currents of Plantagenet politics, even brotherly love had its limits. By 1477, whispers swirled through Westminster that Clarence had grown restless, his ambition curdling into something darker. The Duke, once Edward's staunchest ally in the Wars of the Roses, now moved like a man plotting his own rise, his crime not just dissent but necromancy. The breaking point came when Clarence accused the Queen's family, the Woodvilles, of poisoning his wife. He dragged servants into court, forcing them to swear they'd seen witchcraft practiced against him. Then, in a breathtaking act of defiance, he interrupted a council meeting with armed retainers, demanding justice. Edward, who'd tolerated his brother's theatrics for years, finally snapped. Clarence was arrested not for treason, but for violating a new law against using magic to foresee the king's death, a charge so bizarre it reeked of fabrication. The trial was a farce. Witnesses testified that Clarence had plotted to seize the throne, even hiring astrologers to predict Edward's demise. The king, visibly anguished, signed the death warrant himself. What happened next became one of history's most macabre jokes. On February 18, 1478, Clarence was executed privately in the Tower of London, not by axe or rope, but by drowning in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Some said it was his own request, a final aristocratic flourish. Others suspected darker humor at play, a man who drowned his ambitions in delusions of grandeur, literally drowning in his favorite vice. Clarence's downfall wasn't just personal, it exposed the rot at the heart of the Plantagenets. This was a dynasty built on fratricide, where brothers like Edward and Richard III would turn on each other like wolves fighting over a carcass. The Wars of the Roses had taught them that blood meant nothing when a crown was at stake, and if England's royals couldn't trust their own kin, neither could the Dukes of Burgundy, where a father's favoritism would spark a betrayal so brutal, it made Clarence's fate look merciful. In the glittering Burgundian court, Charles the Bold ruled with an iron fist until his own daughter, Mary, became the pawn in a game he couldn't control. When Charles died in battle in 1477, Mary inherited his lands but not his ruthlessness. Her marriage to Maximilian of Austria should have secured Burgundy's future. Instead, it became a noose. The French king, Louis XI, saw his chance. He'd spent years undermining Charles, and now he turned his sights on Mary, bribing her advisors to isolate her from Maximilian. The betrayal came not from enemies, but from within her council, men who'd sworn oaths to her father, now whispering that she should surrender lands to France. Mary, young and overwhelmed, signed away chunks of her inheritance before realizing the trap. By the time she rallied, it was too late. Her own courtiers had sold her out, proving that in Burgundy, as in England, loyalty was just another currency, and the highest bidder always won. John the Fearless had spent a lifetime mastering the art of political survival. As Duke of Burgundy, he'd navigated the bloody chaos of France's civil wars, outmaneuvering rivals and forging alliances with cold precision. Yet on September 10, 1419, he made one fatal miscalculation. He trusted the promise of safe passage. The setting seemed innocuous enough, a bridge at Montereau where the Dauphin of France, the future Charles VII, had proposed peace talks to end the bitter Armagnac-Burgundian feud. The Duke arrived with minimal guards, believing the truce banner overhead would shield him. He should have known better. The moment John knelt before the Dauphin in a gesture of respect, the trap snapped shut. One of Charles's men, Tanneguy du Chastel, lunged forward with an axe, screaming accusations of treason. Others followed in a frenzy, their blades finding the Duke's body again and again. By the time the butchery ended, John's face was unrecognizable, his corpse left crumpled on the bridge like discarded armor. The Dauphin, just 16 years old, watched in silence, whether shocked or complicit. History still debates. But the message was clear. In France's fractured court, even a truce could be a weapon. The assassination backfired spectacularly. Instead of crushing Burgundian resistance, it ignited a firestorm. John's son, Philip the Good, swore vengeance, allying with England's Henry V. and paving the way for the disastrous Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited the Dauphin. For decades, France would bleed in the shadow of Montereau's betrayal, proving that diplomatic treachery rarely ends the way its perpetrators intend. Yet if France's nobles turned bridges into killing grounds, Hungary's court elevated betrayal to a theatrical art. Across the Alps, another ruler was about to learn that sometimes the deadliest threats wore crowns too, and came armed not with daggers, but with carefully forged letters and the loyalty of a son who'd grown tired of waiting. Elizabeth of Bosnia wore her crown like a target. As queen consort to Louis the Great of Hungary and later regent for their daughter Mary, she stood at the pinnacle of power in 14th century Europe, yet her throne was built on quicksand. The moment Louis died in 1382, the nobles who'd once bowed before her saw weakness instead of authority. A queen ruling in her own right was rare enough, but a foreign-born woman governing for a teenage daughter. To Hungary's fractious aristocracy, it was an invitation to rebellion. The betrayal unfolded like a slow poison. First, the Croatian lords refused to recognize Mary's succession, declaring another noble, Charles of Durazzo, their rightful king. Then the Hungarian barons, sensing blood in the water, began stripping Elizabeth's powers piece by piece. By 1385, what little authority she retained depended entirely on the whims of men who saw her as little more than a placeholder. When Charles invaded Hungary to press his claim, even her supposed allies crumbled. The final blow came at Zadar, where she and Mary were captured not by enemies, but by their own guards, men who'd sworn oaths to protect them, now trading their queens for silver and promises of land. What followed was medieval vengeance at its most brutal. Charles paraded Elizabeth through the streets in chains before imprisoning her in a dank castle dungeon. For months, she endured squalor and humiliation while her daughter was forced to marry Charles's son, cementing his dynasty's claim. Then, in a final act of cruelty, Elizabeth was strangled in her cell in 1387, her body dumped in an unmarked grave. The nobles who orchestrated her downfall, they prospered, rewriting history to paint her as a scheming interloper who'd brought ruin upon herself. Her tragedy exposes a painful truth about medieval queenship. Unlike kings who ruled by divine right, queens regnant, or those acting as regents governed by permission, their authority was always conditional, always contested. Elizabeth's crime wasn't incompetence or tyranny. It was simply existing in a world where power had a gender. But if Hungary's nobles proved how quickly loyalty could dissolve, the Teutonic Order showed how betrayal could fester even among brothers sworn to holy vows. In the frostbitten halls of Marienburg Castle, where knights pledged lifelong obedience to God, one man's ambition would expose the rot beneath the Order's gleaming white crosses and spark a downfall that echoed across the Baltic. Heinrich von Plön should have been a hero. When he became Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights in 1410, the Order was reeling from their crushing defeat at Grunwald, a battle that had left their armies shattered and their reputation in tatters. Von Plön rallied the remaining knights, fortified their strongholds, and negotiated a fragile peace with Poland-Lithuania. For a moment, it seemed the Order might survive. But survival wasn't enough for the men in iron crosses. Behind the towering walls of Marienburg Castle, resentment festered like an untreated wound. The betrayal came not from enemies, but from the very brothers who had sworn to obey him. Von Plön's reforms, stricter discipline, higher taxes to rebuild their forces, and a cautious approach to war anchored the younger knights hungry for glory. They whispered that their Grand Master had grown timid, that his diplomatic overtures to Poland were cowardice disguised as strategy. The final straw came when von Plön dismissed several officers for insubordination. That night, a faction led by the Marshal of the Order, Michael Couchmeister, stormed his chambers. There was no formal trial, no grand assembly, just the cold verdict of drawn swords. Von Plorn was dragged from his bed, stripped of his rank, and imprisoned in the very fortress he'd once commanded. The irony was brutal. The Teutonic Knights, an order founded on absolute obedience, had turned their blades on the man who embodied their ideals. Couchmeister took the mantle of Grand Master, promising a return to martial pride only to lead the order into further decline. Within years, their territories shrank, their influence waned, and the once mighty brotherhood became a shadow of its former self. Von Plorn's fate exposed a painful truth. Even holy warriors weren't immune to the rot of ambition. But if the Teutonic Knights proved that betrayal could fester in the heart of a religious order, the Kingdom of Naples showed how treachery could bloom in the gilded halls of Renaissance courts. Here, a queen's love for her adopted son would collide with his ruthless hunger for power, and the fallout would drown a kingdom in blood. Joanna II of Naples wore her crown uneasily. Twice married and twice widowed under suspicious circumstances, she ruled a court where loyalty was as fleeting as the Mediterranean breeze. Desperate for an heir, she named Alfonso V of Aragon as her adopted son and successor, binding him to her with oaths and titles. But Alfonso, a man who'd spent his life clawing his way to power, saw Naples not as an inheritance but a prize to seize. The betrayal unfolded with calculated precision. Alfonso demanded control of key fortresses, then filled Joanna's court with his own men. When she resisted, he had her favorite lover, Gianni Caracciolo, assassinated in the palace gardens. The message was clear. Her reign was now a puppet show, and he held the strings. Joanna, once a queen who'd played factions against each other with skill, found herself outmaneuvered by the one person she'd trusted as family. Her revenge, when it came, was as swift as it was devastating. In a stunning reversal, she disinherited Alfonso and named Louis III of Anjou as her heir instead. The kingdom erupted into war, with Naples' streets running red as rival factions clashed. Alfonso, humiliated, was forced to retreat to Aragon, but the damage was done. Joanna's court, already fractured, became a den of vipers where no oath could be trusted. The tragedy of Naples wasn't just one woman's miscalculation. It was a lesson in the fragility of Renaissance politics. In a world where adoption could be as binding as blood, trust became the deadliest gamble of all. And as the next tale will reveal, even the most sacred bonds could shatter when power whispered its siren call, this time between a king and the man he'd raised as a son. Joanna I of Naples ruled one of Europe's most dazzling courts, a world of sunlit terraces, scheming nobles, and alliances as fragile as Murano glass. As the first queen regnante of Naples, she'd spent decades navigating the razor's edge of Mediterranean politics, surviving revolts, papal excommunications, and even a husband's suspicious death. But in 1381, she faced a threat no amount of diplomacy could disarm: her own blood. Charles of Durazzo, her Hungarian cousin, had spent years circling her throne like a shark, waiting for the moment to strike. The betrayal began with whispers of heresy. Charles, a master of intrigue, convinced Pope Urban VI that Joanna was conspiring with the rival Avignon papacy, a charge that turned Rome against her. With the church's blessing, he marched into Naples, his army swelling with mercenaries and disgruntled nobles who'd grown tired of Joanna's capricious rule. The queen, confident her fortresses would hold, underestimated Charles's ruthlessness. One by one, her defenders abandoned her, their loyalties bought or bullied. Even her closest advisor, Otto of Brunswick, was captured in a skirmish, leaving her isolated in the fortified Castel Nuovo. The end came with chilling pragmatism. Charles didn't storm the castle, he starved it. After weeks under siege, Joanna surrendered, trusting her royal status would spare her life. She'd misjudged her cousin entirely. Dragged before Charles in chains, she was imprisoned in a remote fortress at Muro Lucano, not as a deposed queen, but as a condemned prisoner. On July 27, 1382, guards entered her cell with silk cushions. The chronicles disagree on whether she was strangled or smothered, but the message was clear. Charles would leave no loose ends. Her body was displayed for days, clad in the robes of a Franciscan nun, a final humiliation for the woman who'd once styled herself as Europe's most glamorous sovereign. The tragedy of Joanna wasn't just her death, but what it revealed about the Neapolitan throne. This wasn't a kingdom ruled by law or divine right, but by opportunism. Charles's victory proved that in Naples, even a crown worn for 40 years could be snatched away overnight. Yet his triumph was short-lived. Within months, rival factions backed Joanna's adopted heir, Louis of Anjou, plunging the kingdom into civil war. Charles, like his cousin, would learn that betrayal begets betrayal, a lesson Scotland's nobility knew all too well. Far from Naples' sun-scorched cliffs, another ruler was discovering how quickly allies could become executioners. As the wars of Scottish independence raged, a hero's trust would be repaid not with a dagger in the dark, but with a public trial and the crack of an axe, proof that in the Game of Thrones, even legends could fall. The name Black Douglas once struck fear into the hearts of Scotland's enemies, a dynasty of warriors who had fought alongside Robert the Bruce and bled for Scottish independence. But by 1452, the Douglas family had become too powerful, their lands too vast, their influence too unchecked, and in the court of young King James II, that kind of power could only be seen as a threat waiting to bloom into rebellion. William Douglas, the 8th Earl of Douglas, carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd inherited not just titles, but an aura of invincibility. He'd married his cousin, the Fair Maid of Galloway, uniting two branches of the Douglas line, a move that looked less like romance and more like a consolidation of a private kingdom. To James, barely 18 and straining under the weight of overmighty nobles, it was a provocation. The betrayal unfolded with the cold precision of a royal ambush. James invited Douglas to Stirling Castle under the guise of discussing grievances, a peace offering, or so it seemed. The Earl arrived with only a small retinue, trusting in the ancient code of hospitality. But as they dined in the castle's great hall, the king's tone darkened. He accused Douglas of conspiring with rebels in the north, of hoarding royal revenues, of plotting to seize the throne itself. When Douglas refused to dissolve his alliances, James drew a dagger. His attendants followed suit, encircling the Earl like hunters closing on a stag. The chronicles claim Douglas lunged for the king's throat, but it was no use. A blade found his heart first. His body, tossed from a castle window into the ravine below, became a grisly proclamation. No noble, no matter how storied, stood above the crown. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just the violence, it's the aftermath. James didn't stop with William. He declared the entire Douglas line forfeit, sending armies to raise their strongholds and scatter their loyalists. The Black Douglas name, once synonymous with Scottish valor, was scrubbed from charters and chronicles as if it had never been. Yet the king's ruthlessness backfired spectacularly. Instead of cowing Scotland's nobility, it ignited a civil war that dragged on for years, proving that in a land where clan loyalties ran deeper than royal decrees, betrayal only bred more betrayal. Scotland's shifting allegiances were a mirror of medieval Europe's brutal political calculus, where today's ally could become tomorrow's corpse with a whisper in the right ear. But if the Douglas saga showed how quickly trust could shatter among warriors, the Kingdom of Aragon would reveal a different kind of treachery, one where the weapon wasn't a dagger but a carefully forged will. There, a queen's deathbed would become the stage for a deception so audacious, it would fracture a kingdom and rewrite the rules of succession. Peter III of Aragon should have been invincible. He'd conquered Sicily in a single daring campaign, defying the Pope himself to claim the island for his wife, Constance, the last heir of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. His navy dominated the Mediterranean, his armies inspired fear, and his court shimmered with scholars and troubadours. Yet by 1285, the very nobles who had cheered his victories were sharpening their knives behind his back. The problem wasn't weakness, it was the opposite. Peter ruled like a force of nature, heedless of the ancient privileges and delicate alliances that bound Aragon's fractious nobility. When he demanded unprecedented taxes to fund his wars and ignored their traditional councils, the whispers began. The conspiracy unfolded like a carefully scripted tragedy. Led by the powerful Count of Foix and Archbishop Sancho of Toledo, the disgruntled nobles reached out to Peter's deadliest enemy, Charles of Anjou, the French prince whose Sicilian throne Peter had stolen. The deal was treason in its purest form. Aragon's nobles would help Charles reclaim Sicily if he, in turn, supported their plot to replace Peter with his own brother, James. Even the Pope, still seething over Peter's defiance, blessed the scheme. The stage was set for one of medieval Europe's most brazen coups. Peter never saw it coming. When his nobles rose in open rebellion, he reacted with bewildered fury, rushing back from Sicily to crush the uprising. But the betrayal ran deeper than battlefield loyalties. Towns he'd considered loyal shut their gates. Treasuries he'd relied on were suddenly empty. Even his own family wavered. His brother James, the intended puppet king, briefly joined the rebels before a last-minute reconciliation. Isolated and outmaneuvered, Peter was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Tarascon in 1285, surrendering Sicily and submitting to papal authority. The king who had once laughed at excommunication now knelt before the very powers he'd scorned. His downfall exposed the fragile reality of medieval kingship. No matter how brilliant a ruler's victories, his throne rested on the shifting sands of noble loyalty. Peter's tragedy wasn't just his own, it was a warning to every ambitious monarch. Rule too weakly and you'd be overthrown. Rule too strongly and you might provoke the same fate. And so we come to our final tale, the betrayal that didn't just topple a king, it reshaped a continent. In the frostbitten halls of Sweden, a sovereign's trust would be shattered not by nobles or rivals, but by the one person who should have been his closest ally, his own brother. What followed wasn't merely a coup, it was the spark that ignited the Protestant Reformation, proving that sometimes the greatest betrayals don't just end dynasties. They change the world. Richard III rode toward Bosworth Field with the weight of a dynasty on his shoulders. The last Plantagenet king, a man who had clawed his way to the throne through shadowy intrigues and the mysterious disappearance of his nephews, now faced an army that threatened to erase his bloodline from history. The year was 1485, and Henry Tudor, a relative nobody with a tenuous claim, had crossed the Channel from exile, gathering rebels and disaffected nobles like a storm gathering strength. But Richard wasn't just battling Tudor, he was fighting the ghosts of his own choices, the whispers of betrayal that had followed him since the day he seized the crown. The true treachery came not from the enemy camp but from within his ranks. The Stanley family, led by Thomas and William, commanded a formidable force on the field that day, men Richard desperately needed. Yet as the battle raged, the Stanleys held back, their banners motionless on the hillside, watching as Tudor's outnumbered forces clashed with the king's vanguard. Then, at the critical moment, they turned. William Stanley's cavalry thundered into Richard's exposed flank, their swords slicing through the royal guard like wheat. The king, seeing his lines collapse, made one final, desperate charge straight toward Henry Tudor's position. It was a move born of either madness or sublime courage, but without the Stanley's support, it was suicide. Surrounded and unhorsed, Richard fought on foot, his crown knocked loose in the mud until a halberd blow ended his life. The last English king to die in battle fell not to a foreign invader, but to the calculated betrayal of men who had sworn him allegiance. The aftermath was as swift as it was brutal. Henry Tudor, crowned on the battlefield with Richard's own diadem, ushered in a new dynasty. The Plantagenets, who had ruled England for over 3 centuries, vanished almost overnight. Yet Richard's downfall wasn't just the end of a king. It was a cautionary tale about the price of power won through suspicion. His reign had been built on the bones of his nephews, his court rife with paranoia. In the end, the very mistrust that kept him isolated made betrayal inevitable. The Stanleys hadn't just switched sides, they'd gambled on the king's inability to inspire loyalty. Bosworth's legacy echoes far beyond a single battle. It marked the death knell of medieval kingship, where personal prowess on the battlefield gave way to political alliances and propaganda. Henry VII, keenly aware of how fragile trust could be, spent his reign rewriting history, painting Richard as a monstrous usurper while quietly adopting his most effective policies. The Tudors, a dynasty born from betrayal, would themselves become masters of the art, proving that in the Game of Thrones, no victory is ever truly clean. These 29 tales of treachery reveal a pattern darker than any single act of deceit. From queens poisoned by their own kin to knights abandoning their oaths, medieval Europe's courts were labyrinths of shifting allegiances. But beneath the blood and broken promises lies a startling truth. Betrayal wasn't the exception, it was the system. In a world where power was inherited, not earned, where marriages were treaties and children were pawns, loyalty was often the first casualty. Yet there's something profoundly human in these stories. The fear of being outmaneuvered, the desperation to cling to status, the moments when ambition overrides conscience. These aren't relics of the past. They're mirrors. The faces change, the weapons evolve, but the heart of these betrayals remains unsettlingly familiar. Perhaps that's why they still captivate us centuries later. Not just as tales of kings and swords, but as reminders that trust, once broken, can reshape the world. And so we close this chronicle where we began, in the shadows of palaces and on the edges of battlefields, where the line between ally and enemy was always thinner than it seemed. The medieval world may be gone, but its lessons linger, whispering that in the end, no crown, no oath, no bond is ever completely safe from the knife of betrayal. Ambition, power, and the fragility of trust, these are the threads that weave through every story of betrayal in medieval Europe's courts. Whether it was a queen overthrowing her husband, a son turning against his father, or a knight abandoning his oath, the pattern was eerily consistent. Loyalty lasted only as long as it served ambition. These weren't just personal tragedies, they were seismic shifts that redrew maps, toppled dynasties, and reshaped the very idea of authority. The medieval world operated on a brutal calculus where power was often more valuable than blood, and trust could be the deadliest liability of all. Consider the sheer scale of consequences. Isabella of France's betrayal didn't just end her marriage, it set a precedent that kings could be deposed. The Templars' downfall didn't merely erase an order, it showed how easily institutions could crumble when greed outweighed honor. And Richard III's fate at Bosworth Field didn't just end a dynasty, it marked the close of an era where kings ruled by the sword alone. Each act of treachery sent ripples through generations, proving that in the courts of medieval Europe, betrayal wasn't just a crime, it was a catalyst. Yet the most haunting question isn't about what happened, but what could have been. Could these rulers have avoided their fates, perhaps if they'd been less trusting or more ruthless? But that's the cruel paradox of power. The very qualities that made some leaders great, like Pedro of Castile's unshakable confidence or Thomas Beckett's principled defiance, also made them vulnerable. In a world where survival demanded constant vigilance, even the wisest rulers couldn't guard against every dagger in the dark. What these stories reveal, more than anything, is the human cost of ambition. The betrayed weren't just names in chronicles, they were fathers, wives, and friends who learned too late that crowns couldn't shield them from heartbreak. And the betrayers, many died as they lived alone, surrounded by enemies they'd once called allies. As we prepare to close this chapter, let's carry forward one indelible lesson. Power might be won by betrayal, but it's rarely held by it. The true legacy of these tales isn't in the throne rooms or battlefields, but in the choices that still resonate today, reminders that trust, once broken, can alter the course of history. And now, as we turn to our final thoughts, consider this. In a world where loyalty was so easily discarded, perhaps the rarest thing of all wasn't power, but the courage to resist its temptations. These tales of medieval betrayal aren't just relics of a bygone era, they're mirrors reflecting the timeless dance of power and human frailty. Each story, from Isabella's calculated overthrow of Edward to the Templars' tragic downfall, exposes a universal truth: trust is the most delicate currency in any age. What makes these betrayals so chilling isn't the daggers or the poisoned cups, but the intimacy of the wounds. These were brothers turning on brothers, queens betraying kings, and knights abandoning vows they'd sworn on sacred relics. The emotions feel startlingly modern: ambition clashing with loyalty, fear masquerading as pragmatism, love curdling into vengeance. Consider how little has changed. Modern boardrooms and political corridors echo with the same whispers that once filled medieval halls. A colleague passed over for promotion, an ally sidelined in a merger, a friendship fractured by competing ambitions. The players wear suits instead of armor, but the game remains eerily familiar. Even on the global stage, alliances shift like sand, and today's staunch partner can become tomorrow's rival with the stroke of a pen. The medieval world simply wore its ruthlessness more openly, its betrayals lit by torchlight rather than hidden behind press releases. Yet there's a haunting beauty in these stories too. They remind us that betrayal isn't just about destruction, it's about transformation. The fall of the Templars reshaped finance and faith. Richard III's demise birthed the Tudor dynasty. Even the smallest acts of treachery sent ripples through history, proving that a single broken promise could alter the fate of nations. It forces us to ask, where do we draw the line between survival and morality? Can power ever be wielded without collateral damage? As the chronicler Froissart once wrote, "In the end, we are all prisoners of our choices." These medieval actors chose crowns over kinship, vengeance over virtue, and their legacies are stained with the consequences. But their stories also offer redemption, not for them, but for us. By studying their mistakes, we glimpse the warning signs in our own lives, the friendships tested by ambition, the loyalties stretched thin by opportunity. So which betrayal lingers in your mind? Was it Anne Boleyn's tragic end, orchestrated by those who once cheered her rise, or perhaps Conradin, the boy king who trusted the wrong ally? Share your thoughts below. History's greatest dramas were meant to be debated. And if these tales of treachery left you as captivated as they horrified you, don't miss our deep dive into medieval justice, where we explore how societies tried, and often failed, to balance power and mercy. Like and subscribe to join us on more journeys through history's shadowed corridors, where every throne hides a story and every crown comes at a cost. After all, as the old proverb warns, trust walks in but betrayal limps out.